The sun over Purgatory Creek was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and bleaching the life from the very air. Jedediah Stone felt it bake the dust into the lines of his face as he guided his weary mare down the town's single, desolate street. This was a place that felt forgotten by God, but remembered by vultures. Doors were shut, windows shuddered against the oppressive heat and the even more oppressive silence. The silence broke near the saloon. A voice, loud and coarse with entitlement, sliced through the stillness. "I'm telling you, Sheriff, that's the one. Caught him red-handed near my herd, just watching him like a wolf watches sheep." Jed reined in his horse, his gaze drawn to the small, tense crowd. At its center stood Silas Blackwood, the biggest landowner in 3 counties, his face flushed with anger. His finger was pointed at a young Apache man, no older than 18. The boy, Cale, stood with a stillness that was more defiant than any shout. His hands were bound, but his chin was high, his dark eyes fixed on a distant mesa, refusing to acknowledge the venom being spat at him. The sheriff, a man whose spine seemed to have dissolved in the heat, wrung his hands. "Now, Silas, we gotta be sure." "Sure, I'm sure," Blackwood boomed, his voice echoing off the adobe walls. "He's a thief and his kind have been raiding us for months. We need to make an example. No trial, no delays. An example, Sheriff, at dawn." A murmur of grim agreement rippled through the onlookers. Justice here was swift, simple, and brutal. The sheriff's shoulders slumped in defeat. "All right, Silas, as you say, dawn it is." 2 deputies grabbed Cale, who didn't flinch, and began dragging him toward the small, windowless jailhouse. Jed watched them go, a familiar, bitter taste filling his mouth. He'd ridden into town looking for nothing more than a drink and a quiet night. Instead, he'd found a lynching dressed up as law. As the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Jed felt the weight of the coming dawn settle upon him like a shroud. The whiskey in Jed's glass did little to dull the sharp edges of his conscience. Purgatory Creek Saloon, usually a hive of boisterous noise, was now a place of murmurs and sideways glances. The townsfolk spoke of the morning's verdict in hushed tones, a collective shame simmering beneath the surface, but no one dared challenge Silas Blackwood's power. Jed down the fiery liquid, the burn in his throat a pale imitation of the fire in his gut. He'd seen this brand of justice before, in other dusty towns, under other unforgiving suns. He'd always kept his head down, told himself it wasn't his fight, and ridden away. The ghosts of those decisions were his constant companions on the trail. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, drawing a few nervous looks. He walked out into the cool desert night, the stars a cold, indifferent audience. The sheriff's office was a lone beacon of lamplight. Inside, Sheriff Miller was nursing a bottle of his own, his face sullen in the flickering light. "Sheriff," Jed said, his voice even but firm as he stepped inside. "That Apache boy Cale, he deserves a proper trial, a real one, not just Blackwood's word against his." Miller looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Blackwood's word is the law in this town, Drifter. You do well to remember that." He gestured dismissively with his bottle. "It's done. The boy dies at sunrise. Now get out of my office before you find yourself in the cell next to him." The finality in the sheriff's voice was like a slammed door. Jed stood there for a moment, the air thick with the scent of stale whiskey and corruption. Pleading was useless. Arguing was a death sentence. He turned and walked out, his boots heavy on the porch. The cell was a small, dark structure behind the office. A profound silence emanated from it. In that quiet, Jed's path became clear. He couldn't outshoot Blackwood's influence or outtalk his corruption, but he could offer something they wouldn't expect. He turned on his heel, his shadow long and decisive under the moonlight, and strode back into the office. Miller looked up, annoyed. "I told you to let the boy go," Jed interrupted, his voice ringing with a conviction that startled the sheriff. "I'll take his place." Sheriff Miller stared for a long moment, his mouth hanging slightly open. The initial shock curdled into a harsh, barking laugh that echoed in the small office. "You've been out in the sun too long, drifter," he sneered. "Get out of here before I throw you in a cell for being drunk." Jedediah didn't move. His gaze was as steady as the desert rock outside. "I'm not drunk, and I'm not leaving. The boy goes free. I take his place. It's that simple." The certainty in Jed's voice finally pierced Miller's bluster, replacing it with nervous suspicion. This wasn't a joke. The sheriff, a man unaccustomed to making decisions without his patron's approval, quickly sent his deputy to fetch Silas Blackwood. Within minutes, the rancher filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the room. His cold eyes swept over Jed. "Miller tells me you have a death wish," Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble. He circled Jed slowly, like a wolf assessing a strange new animal in its territory. "Why? What's the Apache to you? Are you with them?" "I don't know him," Jed replied, his voice even, "but I know what I saw. A man's life being signed away without a question asked. In this country, that's supposed to mean something." Blackwood stopped, a cruel smile touching his lips. He saw no principle, only a puzzle. A man didn't offer his life for nothing. But after a moment of intense scrutiny, he saw only a worn-out drifter with nothing to lose. An idea, cold and pragmatic, formed in his mind. An execution was needed to set an example. It didn't much matter who stood before the rifles. In fact, a white man dying for an Apache might send an even stronger, more chaotic message of his unshakable authority. "Fine," Blackwood declared, his voice final. "You want to be a fool, you'll die a fool's death. Miller, make the trade." The sheriff, relieved, unlocked Cale's cell. The young Apache looked on in stunned silence as Jed was led inside, and the iron door clanged shut behind him. Cale was pushed out into the night, the weight of a stranger's impossible sacrifice settling upon him as he stumbled away from the faint lamplight of the town, his heart pounding with a message he didn't understand but knew he had to deliver. The jagged rocks tore at Cale's feet as he ran, his lungs burning with the cold desert air. He burst into the hidden encampment, a collection of wickiups nestled in a canyon fold, causing figures to stir from their sleep. His father Chaitan, a man whose face was etched with the wisdom of 60 winters, emerged from the largest dwelling, his expression a mask of stern concern. "Cale, what is this?" Before Cale could speak, warriors, gripping knives and rifles, surrounded him. "They let you go," one named Nikan growled with suspicion. "It's a trap." "No," Cale gasped, leaning on his knees, the story tumbling out of him in a torrent of desperate words. He recounted the impossible events in the sheriff's office, the cruel sentence, the sudden arrival of the stranger, the unbelievable offer. "He took my place, a white man, a drifter. He is in the cell, waiting for the sunrise." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gathered men. Sarcasm and doubt colored their faces. "Why would he do this?" Chaitan asked, his voice low and steady, searching his son's eyes for the truth. "I do not know," Cale admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I saw it in his eyes. He was not lying. He has given me my life." Meanwhile, Jed sat on the hard cot in the Purgatory Creek jail. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as a deputy made his rounds. The face of his younger brother Thomas swam in his memory, a flash of a panicked expression during a cattle stampede years ago, a moment where Jed had frozen, a moment he could never take back. This was different. This was a choice. The cell door's small window slid open. A young deputy, barely old enough to shave, peered in. "You want some water, mister?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Jed just nodded. The deputy passed a tin cup through the slot. I don't get it," the boy whispered. "Why do this for him?" Jed took a slow sip of the cool water. "Because no one else would," he said, his voice raspy. He looked towards the barred window, where the black of night was beginning to soften into a deep, bruised purple. Dawn was coming. Back in the canyon, Chaitan looked at the faces of his warriors, then at his son. A debt had been incurred. An honorable man does not let another die in his place. Nikan, he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. Gather the men. We ride. The cell door groaned open, its sound unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. Sheriff Miller stood silhouetted against the graying light, his face a mask of grim duty. Time, stone. Jed rose without a word, his movements measured and calm. The young deputy, his eyes wide and fearful, followed them out into the main street of Purgatory Creek. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of dust and wood smoke. Faces peered from behind curtains, silent witnesses to the morning's grim procession. Their boots were the only sound, a hollow rhythm on the packed earth, leading them towards a clearing just past the last building. There, a stark wooden post was planted in the ground. Silas Blackwood was waiting, leaning against a wagon wheel, a fat cigar jetting from his lips. He offered Jed a smug, dismissive nod. The firing squad, 4 nervous ranch hands clutching rifles, avoided Jed's gaze. Any last words, Drifter? Blackwood drawled. Jed simply looked at the horizon, where a thin line of orange was beginning to bleed into the indigo sky. Just get on with it. He was tied to the post, the coarse rope biting into his wrists. When the deputy offered a black cloth for a blindfold, Jed shook his head. He would meet his end with his eyes open. Miller cleared his throat, his voice unsteady as he raised his hand. Ready, the 4 men raised their rifles, the clicks of hammers being cocked echoing in the tense silence. Aim, the rifle barrels centered on Jed's chest. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. There was only the cold air, the distant sunrise, and the 4 dark muzzles. Miller's mouth opened to shout the final command, but the word never came. A low, deep rumble started, a vibration felt more than heard, growing from the earth itself. Heads turned, the ranch hands lowered their rifles, confused. The rumble swelled into the unmistakable thunder of 100 hooves, a galloping storm cresting the nearby rise, and then they appeared. Silhouetted against the dawn, an unstoppable tide of riders. At their head was Chaitan, his expression like carved granite, and beside him, Cale. Behind them, 200 Apache warriors fanned out, their horses stamping and snorting as they came to a halt, forming a silent, unbreachable wall that blocked the trail and sealed the clearing. The standoff was absolute. The air in the clearing was thick enough to choke on, a suffocating silence broken only by the nervous snorting of horses, and the desert wind whistling past the post Jed was tied to. The firing squad's rifles, once steady, now wavered. Their eyes darted from the impassive line of warriors to Silas Blackwood's face, which was a mask of purple rage. Slowly, deliberately, Chaitan urged his horse forward, Cale flanking him. They stopped a dozen yards from the sheriff. Chaitan's gaze was not on the lawman, but locked onto Blackwood. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but carried across the clearing with the weight of stone. Silas Blackwood, he began, his English measured and clear. This man, he nodded towards Jed, offered his life for my sons. By our laws, a debt of honor has been created. His life now belongs to us. He is under the protection of my people. Blackwood's hand went to the pistol on his hip. This is my town, my law. This drifter interfered. Your law sentenced an innocent boy to die for your pride, Chaitan countered, his voice remaining level. This man showed honor where you showed none. To harm him now is to declare war on us. Look at your men, Blackwood. Look at their faces. They know this is not a fight they can win. Sheriff Miller glanced at the 200 warriors, silent and patient, arrows knocked in their bows. He saw the cold certainty in their eyes. This wasn't a skirmish. It was annihilation. Swallowing hard, he slowly lowered the barrel of his rifle toward the ground. One by one, the other deputies followed suit, their relief palpable. The act broke Blackwood's bluster. He was alone. Hissing a curse, his face contorted with humiliation, he jabbed a finger at Jed. This isn't over, Drifter. He spun his horse around and galloped back towards town, a retreat more damning than any defeat in battle. Miller and his men shuffled away in his wake. Cale dismounted, and with a sharp knife cut the ropes binding Jed's wrists. "You are free," he said, the words heavy with unspoken gratitude. Jed rubbed his raw skin, looking from Kale to Chetan, and then to the warriors who had saved him. He was no longer a lone drifter, but a man tied by honor to a people he barely knew. In the days that followed, an uneasy peace settled over Purgatory Creek. Blackwood had vanished from public view, his authority shattered. Jedediah found a tentative home in Chetan's camp, the quiet respect of the Apache a balm on his weary soul. He shared stories with Kale, their bond deepening beyond the death of life into true friendship. Yet the silence from the Blackwood Ranch felt less like peace and more like a gathering storm. It broke a week later. Jed and Kale were riding a narrow, sun-baked trail back from town with supplies when three figures blocked their path. At the center was Silas Blackwood, his face a mask of raw hatred, flanked by two loyal ranch hands. There was no pretense of law now, only pure vengeance. "Your borrowed time is up, drifter," Blackwood snarled, raising his pistol. Instinct took over. Jed and Kale dove from their horses as the first shot cracked through the air, splintering the rock where Jed's head had been. The canyon erupted into a chaotic exchange of fire. Kale, moving with the fluid grace of a hunter, used the terrain to his advantage, his arrows finding their mark and disabling one of the gunmen. Jed, pinned behind a boulder, knew this had to end here. He waited for Blackwood's overconfidence, the rage that made him sloppy. It came when Blackwood charged forward, believing Jed was cornered. Jed exploded from cover, not with his gun, but with his body. He slammed into the rancher, sending both men tumbling into the dust. The fight was brutal and graceless, driven by desperation and fury. Jed's knuckles were raw, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he saw not a monster, but a pathetic, broken man. With a final, decisive move, he wrenched the pistol from Blackwood's hand and threw it into the scrub. Defeated, Blackwood slumped to the ground, his tyranny ending not with a bang, but with a choked sob. They brought him back to Purgatory Creek, a prisoner stripped of his power. The town, finally free, began to build something new. Jed, standing beside Kale, watching the sunset paint the desert in hues of orange and purple, knew he was no longer drifting. He had found his place.